Hello, everyone. This is Dr. C. Hope you're all doing well and that you've adjusted well to the course. This is our initial video lecture, and I kind of want to just explain things real fast before I get started. Some of the lectures I do will be based off of slides that I create using PowerPoint. Some other lectures will be, like this one, will be based on made using a whiteboard. And sometimes a whiteboard, it just kind of approximates the feeling of being in class as I go over things on the chalkboard or the whiteboard. So sometimes this form is a little bit more useful than the other form. That said, I'm going to go ahead and get started. Today I want to cover a couple of things. Number one, the idea or the notion of discourse communities. And I'm going to go ahead and click that. I'm going to go ahead and pardon my sloppy writing. Right, discourse communities. Put that in quotation marks up here. So discourse communities is one thing I want to talk about. The other thing is ethical argumentation, which is actually part of discourse communities, and I'll explain that connection in just a second. The other thing I want to talk about are the two assignments that you have to do coming up. One is the initial reflection, and one is the sharing assignment. I want to make sure everybody's clear about both of those. So let's go ahead and get started. Discourse communities. Now, I think often when we're looking at terms that we're not familiar with, it actually benefits us if we break them down. So communities, I think everyone knows what that is. Discourse. Discourse basically is a term we use to refer to the ways in which we exchange information or communicate with one another about ourselves, about the world, or about practically anything. When you're in discourse with someone, it means that you're having a conversation with them, that you're talking with them about something. There's a flow of information between the two of you. So discourse can occur between many people at once. Sometimes it can occur in ways that we don't often think of when we think of conversations. Artists are often in discourse with one another, for instance, where if you know what you're looking at when you look at their work, you can see the ways in which one person's work resembles or speaks to or communicates with the work of another artist. The same thing with musicians. They're often in discourse with one another. Filmmakers are often in discourse with one another. Novelists are often in discourse. Poets are often in discourse with one another. Discourse doesn't have to take that sort of like, it sounds dry, discourse. So it sounds like, scientific discourse, medical discourse. You can think of discourse being applied in lots of different ways. It makes it sound really dry, but discourse really refers to any sort of like flow of information between interlocutors. And an interlocutor, I'll spell that out real fast, is someone who is engaged in locution or discourse with someone else. And so if you're talking with your friend, if you're having a conversation with them about something that you're both interested in, or just having a conversation period, you're engaged in discourse with your friend, that means you both are considered to be interlocutors in that conversation. So what a discourse community is if you can imagine doing research or encountering a bunch of sources, arguments, right? Encountering arguments, whether they're documentaries or articles or books, encountering them and reading them, and they're all sort of about the same thing. But some of them, represented by these triangles, talk about, let's say, the subject that you're looking at, but in the specific sort of triangle-related way, right? Whereas others talk about things in a sort of like non-triangle related way, plus related way. But they're all basically talking about the same thing. So let's say they're all talking about Ernest Hemingway, for instance, but the triangles are focused on discussing Ernest Hemingway in the context of the 1940s, while the pluses are more concerned with looking at Ernest Hemingway in terms of how his work and his literary career and his biography is how those things are currently understood today. So a more modern understanding of Ernest Hemingway. But they're all talking about Ernest Hemingway as represented by the circle around all of them, right? Each one of these sources, sometimes they're articles, books, documentaries, etc. Really what they are, often they're put together by more than one person, like documentaries, for instance. Sometimes they're articulated by or put together, or the sources, the arguments that they're making are the product of one person. Regardless of that, I'm going to go ahead and sort of finish my drawing here. and make these sources, oops, I messed that one up. I had to just do this. Make these little sources into stick people so that maybe it's a little bit clearer that when you're looking at sources, you actually, for the purposes of understanding the ways in which you're in discourse with one another, it's easier to understand them. I'll go ahead and finish this one, this poor little triangle. It's easier to understand how discourse works if you think of the sources and the arguments you encounter as actually being voices, being the product of people who are making a case and making an argument. Those arguments often intersect with and overlap with one another. And when that happens, when you have that kind of overlap and intersection and communication with one another, then you have the formation of what's referred to as discourse communities. It's nothing more than a group of people who are talking with, who are of like mind, who have shared concerns. They're talking about something that that is interesting to all of them, or that touches upon the work that all of them do, or the arguments that they tend to make. So that's what a discourse community is, and its connection to ethical argumentation is fairly simple. And I'll try to explain it by kind of detailing the ways in which students tend to write essays before they come to Writing 121, and then the ways that they're taught to write essays in Writing 121. So before Writing 123 is what I meant to say. So before this class, in other words, before this class and after this class. In this class, I try to change some of your habits. And one of the biggest sort of habits that students have when they come into a class like this is they come out of high school or whatever class they took before this one with the idea that when you get an argument essay assigned to you in a class, then the first thing you need to do is write a thesis statement. And you use that to find sources that agree with you. You take those sources and set them off to the side, find a few sources that disagree with you, and you take those sources and set them off to the side. And then your job, when you're crafting the essay, is to go through and actually map out your thesis statement, hunt down some quotes in the sources that agree with you, use those sources to help you as support in the essay, right? Find some quotes, use those quotes. Find some quotes from the sources that disagree with you. Use those quotes to set those sources up so you smack them down and show how good your argument is. Draft the essay. Make sure you've got your citations, your documentation, polish it, proofread it, submit it for a grade. Now, in classes where essays are assigned, what they're actually testing is they're tests basically, right? What they're actually testing, especially with term papers and college level work, is your absorption of the material being taught and your facility with it. And in classes where you're required to do research, they're also testing whether you can build upon the knowledge you gain in the class through a disciplined and formalized research process. None of that really sort of like is evident in the workflow that I've just outlined. And this kind of work, it's much better, much more ethical, smarter, wiser, and it's the kind of work you're going to be doing in this course to synthesize your arguments. In other words, you begin less with a thesis statement and more with a question that you try to answer through the research process and through an engagement with a specific discourse community. Then you attempt to let that research help you reshape your question, because obviously the more you learn, the better questions you can ask. The better questions you ask, the stronger the argument will arrive at the end of the process. So ultimately, what should end up happening in that process is sort of like an iterative process where you go back and forth between the sources you're looking at and the questions you're answering, and you reshape your question according to what you learn, right? That's the process. You can think of it as a process of informing your opinion before you deliver your opinion, which is in the form of a thesis statement. You do that, all that heavy-duty lifting first, and it's easier to craft the essay because A, you know exactly what it is you're arguing. B, you know exactly what your reasons are for what you're arguing. C, your sources help produce those reasons or that reasoning, which means D, it's easy to use your sources in an ethical and sound and reasonable and concise way to support the argument that you're making. So it's always easy for us as professors and instructors to tell when a student is producing an essay using the first workflow versus the second workflow. The first workflow is basically treating an essay like busy work. The second workflow is what you often see in the work of students who understand that the act of writing an essay is literally the act of understanding what it is that you're writing about. It's an attempt to understand something. Essay, by the way, is actually from a French word that means to try or to attempt. Again, sometimes breaking words down and trying to figure out what they mean from the component parts can help you understand the concept even more effectively. So ethical argumentation arises when we, A, understand the concept of discourse communities, B, understand that our arguments are meant to be synthesized from the sources that we encounter. And we'll talk more about synthesis as we move through the term. It's a very important concept. Might just be a little confusing to go into here, but we'll talk about it a little later in the term. I believe my next lecture or the one after discusses synthesis more directly. So ethical argumentation grows out of synthesis, and it tends to be respectful of the fact that we're all basically trying to understand things. In other words, it's respectful of the fact that there are many people who are engaged in the effort of trying to build upon our knowledge through ethical argumentation, and your own work ought to respect that process and to participate in that process. So ethical argumentation is really difficult using the workflow that students often bring into this class, but it's a lot easier to accomplish using the workflow that we try to engage with in this course when it comes to building your own argument essays. I hope that makes sense. So I want to move from here to talking just briefly about your initial reflection. The initial reflection prompt is pretty clear and straightforward, I think. I do want to clarify what it means by formal. Formal in this class just basically means, it's like a paper. If I don't say formal and you have an assignment that boils down to a discussion forum post, then you don't have to give it a title or a heading and treat it like a paper. But if it says formal, then even if it's something that you're inserting into a text box, you've got to treat it like a paper, right? So title, heading, etc., that kind of stuff. It is a discussion forum post in that you're entering things into it. Well, it's not a discussion forum post. The way that you're submitting the assignments, what I meant to say, is as something that you are entering into a text box. I strongly suggest that you don't type your work into text boxes in this class, that you type your work into a word processor document or word processing document, and you copy and paste text into text boxes in this class. This will help prevent issues that sometimes occur when web browsers seize up, which can happen, right? It's much smarter to type your work in a document and then copy and paste it into the text box. So that's my advice for the initial reflection. The sharing assignment, there's a video prompt for that assignment. It's pretty straightforward. I believe the video prompt walks you through this, but once the assignment has been submitted, once a deadline is passed, I just want you to go back to the sharing assignment and just, based on what you've learned at this point in the term or by that point in the term about the argument essays required of you in this class, how they work, how they're produced, what they tend to feature, I'll have you go back and look at your work and the work of your peers to assess whether you see anything in that sharing assignment that looks similar to what you'll be producing in this class in terms of the argument essays that you're producing in this class, so the essays at the end of each essay cycle, right? So yeah, that's about it. Let me know if you have any questions or concerns, and I'll do my best to help you out, but that is it for today's lecture.